Boris Johnson has proposed major changes to national insurance, which could amount to a multi-billion-pound tax cut if the Conservatives win the election. The current threshold applies national insurance contributions when someone earns at least £8,628 a year. Mr Johnson says he would raise the threshold to £9,500, which would mean a tax saving of around £85 a year for every worker. And Mr Johnson claimed that the threshold might eventually rise to £12,500, which would mean a tax saving of more than £450 a year. Our Deputy Political Editor, John Pienaar, looks at the implications of these plans and asks how realistic they are.
Boris Johnson has a big job in this election: win round the hard hat vote, the working class support he needs on polling day. Out campaigning today, promising lower taxes wasn't enough.
You said low tax. Do you mean low tax for people like you or low tax for people like us?
I mean low tax for people, for working people. We're going to be cutting national insurance up to 12,000.
A taste then of tax cuts for all, including lower earners. But the £12,500 starting rate for national insurance would be phased in over years. There'd be an immediate increase to £9,500, worth £85 a year, say, from next April.
If the Conservatives were to raise the national insurance threshold this far, it wouldn't leave them with much space at all, really, for additional spending increases or tax cuts elsewhere. They've said they want to balance the current budget. This would use up all of the headroom that they've got.
Boris Johnson's tax promise echoed a pledge made during his party leadership campaign. His opponents, as you'd expect, weren't impressed.
Boris Johnson's throwing around spending pledges and tax cuts like it's confetti. But he's not telling you how he's going to pay for it. And given that his proposals for Brexit will undermine our economy and reduce growth, these pledges are completely unbelievable.
Well, it's a regressive tax, so yes, of course, some people will benefit from this, but the very well-off will benefit even more than those people on low incomes.
Labour says the Tory tax promise fails to make up for what it calls 10 cruel years of cuts.
Let's not get over the top on this particular policy, and after 10 years of austerity, if this is all the government have got to offer, they're falling way short of what they need to do.
The giveaways keep coming. Mr Johnson's also promised more tax cuts for higher earners as well recently. The signs are that'll have to wait. Either way, so far this election's been about ending austerity and pleasing voters. Worrying about how to pay for those promises, that comes later. The PM's been good at grabbing attention, but attention and trust aren't the same thing. Boris Johnson wants and needs both. John Pienaar, BBC News.
With me in the studio, our economics editor, Faisal Islam. I think it's fair to say, Faisal, this policy emerged in a slightly unusual way today, not in a formal campaign way initially. What do you make of the figures and what do you make of the claims they're making?
Well, as it was explained when an enterprising member of the public managed to extract it from the Prime Minister, that would have been an incredibly radical policy, levelling up the rate at which workers start to pay national insurance with the income tax level, cost billions, nearly £10 billion, would have been a hefty tax cut for millions and millions of workers. Actually, what's transpired as to what will actually be in the manifesto tomorrow is more modest than that. What's been described to me as a down payment, as you explained, an increase of just under £1,000 in the threshold to £9,500. That means a tax cut from now of about £100. Actually, if you take into account the fact that inflation would have lifted that threshold a little bit anyway, it's £85, costs about £2 billion. So a sort of a big ambition from the Prime Minister, no time frame being put on that 12,500 number, but actually what's going to be in the manifesto tomorrow, pretty modest, a £2 billion tax cut.
Faisal, thanks very much. We'll talk to you again a little later on, but for now, thanks a lot, our economics editor there. Now, with just over 3 weeks to polling day, the Liberal Democrat leader, Jo Swinson, has launched her party's manifesto. There is a promise to stop Brexit and to build what they call a new future for the UK inside the European Union. The party claims that staying in the EU will give a £50 billion boost to spend on public services. And on climate change, they are setting a target of generating 80% of our electricity from renewable sources by 2030. Our political editor, Laura Kuenssberg, has more details.
The voice of Remain, Jo Swinson.
How she wants to make a big entrance onto the national stage. Why she believes the Lib Dems matter.
We are the only party that can win a significant number of seats from the Conservatives and deprive them a majority.
But while the nightclub's different enough to the other parties, can stopping Brexit at all costs really appeal?
The manifesto actually calls Brexit a national humiliation. Now, is that a way to describe what was a democratic decision?
I do believe it has become a national embarrassment for our country when, you speak to people in other countries looking at us and they look at us with puzzlement.
But what message do you think that sends to a Leave voter who might just have heard you say that? Very candidly, you are seeking to overturn what was a narrow but clear decision taken by the majority of voters in this country.
So I recognise that the vote in 2016 had that result. The people who want Brexit don't agree on what Brexit looks like. And what that leads me to be concerned about is I don't think there is a majority in this country for any specific form of Brexit. And that is why I think it is very worrying to embark on a path that the government's analysis says will make us poorer if we don't even have confidence that that is what a majority of the population actually want.
A few weeks ago, you said you were a candidate to be Prime Minister. Do you say now that's still really the case?
I'm the Liberal Democrat candidate to be Prime Minister. Not a single vote has been cast in this election. People still do have a genuine choice. I recognise that is a big step to take from where the polls look like they are right now. I'm not going to be deterred from my vision for our country.
Can you level with people now and admit that it is extremely unlikely unless something very odd happens in this campaign?
It's certainly possible. And, politics is about trying to achieve change.
If there's no majority, you could have an extremely influential role on the morning of Friday the 13th of December. Now, at the moment, as things stand, would you countenance working in any way with a government led by Jeremy Corbyn, yes or no?
We're not putting Jeremy Corbyn into number 10 with Liberal Democrat votes, nor will we put Boris Johnson into number 10 with Liberal Democrat votes.
It is one thing to say Liberal Democrat MPs would not vote for a government programme of Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn. Would you actually block either Jeremy Corbyn or Boris Johnson from forming a government?
Yeah, I do not want to see either of them forming a government.
That's not my question.
But what I'm saying to you, Laura, is that I think we should be more imaginative about what happens. You have MPs in those two main parties who do not necessarily themselves agree with their own party leadership.
What, are you suggesting there could be some kind of government of national unity the morning after if there's no majority?
I mean, I don't rule that out as an option.
Wow, you're doing times tables.
Beyond Brexit, it's an ambitious and expensive manifesto. An extra $10 billion a year for schools in England, thousands of extra teachers, a stretching target on cutting emissions, and a special tax to be spent on health and care for the elderly. The Lib Dems are still controversial.
Now, you can't be sure that these numbers will add up.
There is wide agreement that our economy will be bigger if we remain in the European Union, and we have taken a cautious end of those estimates to calculate our Remain bonus, and we are being honest about the need to raise more money through taxation, whether that's on corporation tax, putting that up to 20%, or whether that's a penny on income tax for the NHS, to fund our spending promises too.
A few weeks ago, it felt the Lib Dems could be heading for a much bigger platform. Her role, though, may ultimately be not about what she would do, instead, who she would choose. Laura Kuenssberg, BBC News, London.
Let's stay with the Lib Dems because among the pledges outlined by the party today were a promise of free childcare for children of working parents from 9 months old. There are plans to recruit 20,000 more teachers. They're promising to make significant improvements to mental health services. Our chief political correspondent, Vicki Young, reports from Cornwall, where the Lib Dems are trying to win seats from the Conservatives.
There's an election on, but there's still plenty of time for seasonal celebrations. Tonight, the streets of Truro were lit up by hundreds of handcrafted lanterns. This was the only part of Cornwall that voted to remain in the EU. But what will be on the minds of the volunteers behind this event when they go to the polls?
I think there's more to the country than just Brexit, and I think other things need to be considered.
Education, I'm a teacher or an ex-teacher, but also the lack of funding in education and NHS.
For me, Brexit is important. I feel it very sad that we're turning our back on Europe.
So the Liberal Democrats saying that they would stop Brexit if they could, or at least have another referendum, does that appeal to you?
Yes, that appeals to me.
The Liberal Democrats are confident of making progress in Cornwall and the rest of the South West, but they do face a tough challenge in many areas. There was a time when every seat in Cornwall had a Liberal Democrat MP. Today, they're all Conservative. Plus, Labour has performed far better in recent general elections, which means the Lib Dems need a spectacular turnaround if they're to gain seats like Truro back again.
This brewery is proud of its Cornish ale and sells it to pubs all over the country. The business is doing well, but the owner's worried about the economy slowing down after years of uncertainty over Brexit. So how is the Lib Dems' pro-EU message going down here?
I voted to remain for the very reasons that I wanted stability. Now I'm not so sure because I just think we need to get out.
Upstairs in the office, most think this election will be dominated by Brexit.
The Lib Dems, they've got a very clear message on Brexit. Do you know what that message is, and is it something that appeals to you?
They will revoke Article 50. I get that. They need a USP. That's their USP. Whether people believe it, I think it's too little too late for them.
I don't want another referendum. I think that's totally wrong. We voted once. That's the way we should go.
I think that we would be better off remaining.
And they have a very strong message on that, the Liberal Democrats.
They do, but I don't know how much I trust them. They are, and I don't know how much power they have got to be able to make that change.
The Lib Dems' election strategy depends on voters choosing them in order to register anger over Brexit, something that might not work in Leave areas in the southwest. Vicki Young, BBC News, Truro.
So to ask the direct question, how would the Lib Dems pay for the pledges that they're making? Our economics editor Faisal is back with me to look at the figures.
Thanks, Huw. The Liberal Democrats have set out fairly significant plans to change spending and taxation over the next Parliament. Uniquely, they're aiming to tax more than they spend day to day, tighter than both Labour and the Conservatives. That message underlies all these numbers and is one reason why, for example, the Lib Dems will be the only major party promising a 1p rise in income tax, including the basic rate, raising £8 billion a year. There's over £15 billion business tax rises on corporation and capital gains tax. And now this one's interesting, £5 billion extra from air passenger duty. But the party plans to make it cheaper for most holidaymakers, meaning massive rises of hundreds of pounds per flight for some frequent flyers. The Lib Dems once again say £1.5 billion can be raised from legalising and taxing cannabis. But here's something you don't often see. Almost all these revenue increases are connected in the manifesto with specific spending rises. That last tax on cannabis goes to the police. The air passenger rise is connected to funding the fight against climate change, business taxes on extending childcare and free school meals, and the income tax hike is for the funding pressures on health and social care. The message being that prudence has a purpose. The Lib Dems think the public wants honesty about the inevitable costs of funding pressures from, say, an ageing society. The biggest source of extra revenue, though, is from stopping Brexit, the so-called Remain bonus. That's tax revenues arising from a prediction of a larger economy. That's £50 billion over 5 years. That goes to 20,000 extra teachers and extra welfare support. But how would such ring fencing even work? Fewer teachers from a smaller Remain bonus, less police support if cannabis revenues fall short. It couldn't actually be earmarked, as the Lib Dems have said. As well as this sort of day-to-day spending, the Lib Dems will invest much more, £130 billion in big green projects such as rail electrification and also further education colleges. Less than Labour, more than the Conservatives. It is a manifesto that retains some of the tough austerity message at a time when others are parking that concern. It's a bet that the public prefers hard truths to easy promises. Huw.
Faisal, thanks very much once again. Faisal Islam there, our economics editor.